Hello and welcome, and I hope you can hear me all right. So today we are going to discuss animal ethics, the part of moral philosophy and practical ethics that deals with our moral obligations towards non-human animals. What's interesting about animal ethics is it's kind of exploded as an area of interest in philosophy within the last 50 years or so. Prior to that, discussions of animal ethics were very much neglected within philosophy. So I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully you'll be able to see it okay. 1 second there now. Okay. So when we're exploring animal ethics, we're dealing with a topic in practical ethics and moral philosophy more generally, but also a topic that's relatively recent, of relatively recent interest to philosophers. And one of the questions that animal ethicists are concerned with is the question of the moral status of animals. And one philosopher recently, Shelley Kagan, distinguished between moral standing and moral status to try and capture what's at issue when we discuss these things. So to explain, to say that something has moral standing is to say that it counts, morally speaking, in its own right. So that it counts morally. So there are principles, moral principles, limiting how we may treat the thing in question. And if we violate these principles, we actually wrong that being. So there's general agreement that any being that can suffer harm, any sentient being, any being that has capacity for experiential well-being, is something that has moral standing. And most philosophers these days consider sentient animals that can feel and can suffer harms and experience suffering, have moral standing. Historically, some philosophers thought that animals were mere automatons, but that isn't something that people generally think these days. What is still, though, being discussed is not whether or not animals have moral standing. It's widely accepted that they do. The disagreement exists more about their moral status. Just what precisely are the limitations in regard to how we treat them? What exactly is permissible? So it's a concerns about their moral status. There's acceptance that animals have moral standing, and the questions concern the level of their moral status. Moral status meaning what we might call something's normative profile. Normative being to do with how one ought. So the set of features that govern how that particular being ought to be treated. So that's something where there is still some disagreement. And also disagreement exists about the extent of our positive obligations to non-human animals. So while there might be widespread agreement about the extent of our duties not to inflict harm upon various animals, the extent of duties to aid or how much we are obliged to look after animals who are suffering is something that's a bit more, well, there's more disagreement about that. So I just wanted to set it up to show some of the sort of considerations that animal ethicists are concerned with. First of all, to see how is it that we ought to understand the status of non-human animals. And there's different views on this. So as I mentioned, the idea that animals have no moral standing or status is no longer one that's very prevalent or prominent. But there are still different categories of thought about the moral status of non-human animals. So some argue that animals have full moral status, or status that is equal to human beings. So the idea here is that sentient animals have just as much interest in avoiding pain and suffering as humans, and that suffering and pain is equally bad for them. And the principle being evoked here is that equal interests demand equal consideration. If we privilege our own species and treat animals as though they have a lower moral status, if we think we can treat them differently to how we treat other human beings, we're guilty of something, some sort of bias, what we might call speciesism. So the idea here is that if an animal can feel pain and suffering just as much as a human, and the fact that the animal can feel pain and suffering means that they would have an interest in avoiding it, these sorts of interests are equally strong, and the harms and suffering are equally bad. And unless we are to be guilty of some sort of species bias or prejudice in favour of our own species, we should treat equal interests in the same way. So that's one view. A different view is that moral status is hierarchical, that persons or beings with very certain high cognitive abilities, rational abilities, have a higher moral status than animals, but also that some animals have higher moral status than others because of differences in cognitive abilities and so on. And on this view, it would be held that there's no reason to assume that the class of persons, as in beings with full moral status, is exclusively human. It might be that some non-human animals might also merit this status. The point here is that there's a difference depending on certain features of oneself, one's abilities to reason or to plan or to make choices for oneself, one's maybe a capacity for autonomy and furthering one's own good. Lots of different things that come into play when there are discussions of personhood. The idea here is that these things make a difference as to the sorts of treatments that are permissible. But in either case, regardless of whether one believes that animals have full moral status and should be treated with equal consideration, or whether one thinks that there's some sort of hierarchy of moral status, most ethicists and most philosophers who are interested in animal ethics agree that our current attitudes and practices towards animals are deeply problematic, and that a very urgent task for moral philosophy is to illustrate how animals count tremendously more than mankind seems ready to acknowledge. So regardless of one's views on the details as to the precise details of the status of non-human animals, there is agreement that currently we treat animals a lot worse than we should. Now, I want to move on from just talking about status and standing here to mention a newer area of interest in animal ethics. So up until even more recently, discussions in animal ethics focused almost exclusively on captive or domesticated animals. And very little attention was paid to issues pertaining to wild animal suffering. For obvious reasons, there's a sort of presumption that we should maybe leave well enough alone in nature, and also intervening in nature it certainly seems like something that's more difficult to do, and it might be much more achievable to try and deal with the what seems to be the more pressing worries and issues with regard to our harming animals that we have domesticated or are in captivity. However, there has been an increasing interest in the problem of wild animal suffering, and there have been arguments advanced that actually, despite the sort of intuition that many have that we should leave nature alone, some have argued that we do in fact have a duty to investigate and research safe ways of providing assistance to wild animals who are suffering, perhaps even on a large scale. So I want to just introduce the idea of wild animal suffering, or kind of motivate some of the reasons for investigating how we might be able to help wild animals. And it just is a fact that the majority of the suffering in the world actually takes place in wild nature. The amount of suffering in nature is huge. So billions of wild animals live lives that are even more painful and distressing than their captive counterparts. At any given time, thousands of animals are in the process of starving to death or dying from dehydration. Others suffer through habitat loss brought about by human activities and climate change, sometimes also by natural disasters. Still others suffer from disease, injury, and parasitism. And every day, millions of wild animals are eaten alive, with some of these suffering very long and agonizing deaths. So the idea of things being all very much peace in nature is an illusion. I think that most of us know that there's lots of suffering that goes on in nature, but we tend to kind of not contemplate how extensive it might be, because it is often far removed from our view. And wild animal suffering, a lot of it is caused by human activities, that is true, but there's also a lot of suffering that isn't actually caused by human activities that would happen anyway. Suffering as a result of various natural disasters, various weather conditions, adverse weather conditions, and of course predation and other harmful things such as disease, illness, parasites. So the question kind of to be asked is, given the extent of this suffering, we ought to consider what, if anything, should we be doing about this? What are the extents of our responsibilities towards wild animals who are suffering? What ought we to do? And of course, we currently do offer some assistance to wild animals who are suffering. A lot of the time, we think that we don't intervene, or that there's a policy of non-intervention everywhere, but while that is true, that there's some laws in different jurisdictions that prohibit kind of intervening to aid animals who are suffering, there are many instances in where we do offer assistance. So, for example, some animals who are injured or ill in the wild are offered veterinary attention, are brought in for veterinary care, or are brought in for shelter when they're recuperating from injury. Sometimes animals that are trapped in frozen ponds or stuck in other ways are helped, are rescued, are helped to be released. And even on a bit of a larger scale, we often have vaccination programs for wild animals, such as oral rabies vaccines for foxes, coyotes, raccoons, things like that. So assistance is provided in certain instances. The question, I suppose, that people working in this area are concerned with is, should we do more than this? What are the extent of our positive obligations towards wild animals? Should we be offering assistance or trying to alleviate their suffering on a larger scale than we currently are? And one view about this, often what might be seen as the common sense view, is that we have duties of assistance to animals whenever we've deliberately created their vulnerability or dependence. So on this view, we would have extensive duties to domesticated animals, but not the same level of duty towards animals in the wild. Except we should do something to help those wild animals whose suffering is caused by humans, because we have created some of the vulnerability there. So it's a tiered sort of level of responsibility. It's not just the extent of what we should do to help animals is not just determined, let's say, by their status or standing, but actually our relationship towards them. So the view here is that if we have created conditions of dependence, or if we have caused prior harms, then we have duties to help alleviate or to assist. And this comes from the sort of idea that reparation or compensation for prior harms is something that we expect, that widely accepted in the case of humans as well. So a related thought to this sort of view is that wild animals perhaps should have sovereignty over their own territory or domain, that we should not interfere for the most part and let them be sovereign in their own area, but we should only interfere when either trying to ameliorate harms that we have caused, or perhaps sometimes, but only in specific circumstances, depends on the context, to provide isolated assistance to individual animals who are in dire need, and when we know that doing so will not give rise to greater harm, or there won't be great costs in so doing. It's the idea that if an animal is in dire need and you could provide assistance to that animal without bringing about greater harm, maybe that's permissible, but it will depend on the circumstances. But as regards our duties, our duties are stronger to those in whom we have played a causal role in creating a position of vulnerability and dependence. And in general, otherwise, we should view wild animals as sovereign over their own territory. Okay, so that's one view. As I said, it might be seen as the common sense view. It sounds quite plausible. Another view, which is more controversial and initially counterintuitive to many, is that we have actually a stronger duty or stronger positive obligation. So the view here is that we have, at least on the face of it, a moral obligation or strong moral reasons to aid animals in the wild whenever doing so would not cause more suffering. And the idea here is that we've a duty to alleviate suffering when we can do so without causing more harm. And if we remove any speciesist tendencies, if we remove the thought that there's that we are of a higher status than animals, then alleviating animal suffering whenever we can do so and without causing more harm is something that we ought to do as well, just as we would in the case of humans. And on this view, the duty to aid includes offering large-scale assistance if and when it is safe to do so. So the idea is that if we accept that suffering is bad, no matter who's experiencing it, and we think we ought to alleviate suffering when it's in our power to do so, and we can reasonably expect our action to be effective, we should work to alleviate wild animal suffering, even when we're not causally responsible for it. Now, the idea here is not that we immediately jump in and offer large-scale assistance. Given our limited knowledge of ecosystems, that would be unwise, and we would be very likely to do more harm than good. The idea is more that we have strong reasons to research and investigate ways in which we could safely offer large-scale assistance to animals who are suffering. And with the view to doing that if we find ways that are safe to do so. So it's a sort of proceed with caution approach, while still arguing that the extent of our positive obligations towards wild animals are quite extensive. Okay, so potential objections to this sort of approach come from the ideas advanced in the view we mentioned previously, plus some other potential concerns. So some who disagree or oppose the sort of thought that we should be looking at the possibility of larger scale interventions posit moral reasons against so doing. So one view might be that wild animals are an outgroup that we should not interfere with. The sort of idea we mentioned earlier about wild animals having sovereignty over their own territory or domain. Others might argue that while we have a strong duty not to inflict suffering, we have no corresponding duty to alleviate suffering we have not caused. In the case of wild animals, particularly because we have not created their position of dependency. So if it is a position of dependency within them, so if it is the case that they're experiencing suffering that is not due to us, we don't have a duty to alleviate it, even though we have a strong duty not to inflict suffering upon them. Another moral reason objection that appeals to a sort of moral reason is a preservationist argument, the idea that natural ecosystems have intrinsic value, and loss of this value due to intervention outweighs any value brought about by alleviating animal suffering. So the idea is that there's actually value in leaving the natural ecosystem as it is, and we would lose that if we intervened, and that would be worse than any benefits that might be accrued to individual animals. That might be a worse outcome, and that it might outweigh any values brought about. And also some practical reasons are advanced in objections. So the idea that there's nothing that we can do to prevent suffering in nature anyway. Now, of course, that isn't really true. We've already mentioned that there's some things that we can do to alleviate suffering. I suppose the argument here is that there's nothing that we can do to eliminate it, and that may be true. But the idea that there's nothing that we can do to reduce suffering is certainly not true. Whether or not that we can do something on a large scale is yet, of course, to be figured out. But some still advance the view that there's nothing that we can do. But it seems like the only thing there is that there's nothing we can do to fully eliminate suffering. And another concern, of course, is the idea that we would inevitably do more harm than good. And of course, that is always a very significant worry, given man's poor track record when it comes to intervening in nature. The idea that we would do more harm than good is always present. So certainly would suggest a need for caution. But the idea, I suppose, that we maybe should explore whether there is something we can do, maybe tentatively, is something that's still up for discussion. So the moral reasons that we advanced earlier, the ones about leaving kind of animals have sovereignty over their own territory, and the idea that there's a difference in the extent of our positive obligations to animals depending on our relationship to them, also have certain plausibility. But this is a point of debate. The idea that some feel that we have the extent of our positive duties varies depending on our relationship and whether we have caused harms before, or the idea that we actually have quite strong positive duties, regardless of whether we've inflicted any prior harms. And this is a point of difference amongst ethicists. What is there's a debate about what we should do, what are the extent of these obligations. So that's something that is interesting to discuss. So I'm going to stop the screen share there now. And that was just an introduction to some of the ideas that are being voiced when it comes to wild animal ethics. And there's plenty, of course, that we can discuss about that. So I'm just going to stop the recording there now. And I hope you found that gave you some food for thought and for discussion. Thank you.